They say the night James Earl Jones died, the world lost a legend. The deep, warm voice behind Darth Vader and Mufasa fell silent. News headlines called him an icon, a pillar of stage and screen, a voice Hollywood would never forget. But behind that unforgettable sound was a man who, according to those closest to him, spent his entire life hiding things he never dared say out loud. We all know the characters. We all know the voice. But what kind of life did that voice belong to? Few people realize James Earl Jones once wanted to walk away from everything, shaken by the tragic death of his wife. Even fewer know that for more than 50 years he chose not Los Angeles or Manhattan, but a secluded mansion buried deep in the woods of Pawling, New York, a place no press tours ever reached, where colleagues rarely set foot, and where it was later claimed he kept a secret he never shared publicly. After James passed away at the age of 91, something about that house refused to rest. The mansion was sealed. No new owner moved in. It never appeared on the market. And then on the night of September 9, his birthday, strange reports began to surface. Witnesses said a light in the study flicked on by itself, even though the electrical system had allegedly been cut off months earlier. A neighbor living just 300 meters away claimed they heard a low, raspy whisper drifting from the attic, eerily similar to Darth Vader, not the polished performance from the films, but something raw, as if he were finally saying words he had never been allowed to speak in life. Weeks later, a team of lawyers arrived to inventory the estate. Their job was simple: list the assets, divide the fortune. James Earl Jones's mansion, the woods, the recordings, the relics of a legendary career. But what they found in the library turned a routine legal process into a story people still argue about. The library itself was unlike anything the public ever saw. James bought the property in the winter of 1973, right after the Great White Hope carried him from Broadway into the ranks of Hollywood's immortals. Instead of buying a flashy home near the studios, he spent roughly $235, a huge sum at the time, on quiet, on distance, on a retreat at the edge of the woods. The house sprawled over more than 740 square meters, with 7 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms. But the heart of it was a circular library, lined with rare ebony wood. On the ceiling, an artist hand-painted Shakespeare quotes commissioned just for him. No press ever saw that room. Those ceiling lines, those dark walls, belonged only to James, the books, and the voice that made him famous. Behind that library, hidden from view, sat the voice studio, the room where he recorded lines for Darth Vader, Mufasa, CNN, and scores of other projects. It was said the studio was fully soundproofed and secured with biometric locks that opened only to his voice. Beyond that, according to one longtime housekeeper, there was something else, a basement space that never appeared on any blueprint, concealed behind a false bookshelf. The housekeeper claimed that on an October night years ago she saw James slip through that hidden doorway, clutching a dark wooden box, his eyes red and swollen, as if he'd been crying for hours. What he kept down there no one could say. The room didn't exist on paper. The door wasn't supposed to be there. And James never spoke about it. From 2016 onward, another part of the house changed. He suddenly locked the attic and barred staff from entering. Without explanation, he installed an electronic lock and tied it to an alarm system. The top floor went silent. No footsteps, no light, as if something had been sealed away that no one else should disturb. James lived in that mansion until September 2022, when he died at 91. The property was sealed. No for sale sign ever appeared. Estimates later put its value at over $3.2 million, but the house stayed frozen, an empty shell packed with more than half a century of memories and unspoken choices. When the estate lawyers opened the heavy oak desk in the ebony library, they discovered a hidden compartment beneath the third drawer. It didn't respond to keys or tools, only to a voice command. After several failed attempts, they tried playing a 1992 recording of James reading for a charity project. According to people who heard the story, the mechanism clicked open as soon as his voice filled the room. Inside lay a supplemental contract dated November 1977. It wasn't with one of the giant studios everyone expected, but with a much smaller production outfit from early in his career. What shook the room wasn't the money attached to it, but the implications. Lawyers on the scene described the contents as revealing a raw truth James had never shared publicly, a truth that, at least for now, remains locked behind legal walls and carefully chosen words. Today, the house still stands unsold and unclaimed. Locals say that if you walk past the library window on the night of September 9th and stand very still, you might hear a sound that doesn't quite belong to the wind or the trees. Whether that's superstition, grief, or something stranger is a question no one has fully answered. But to understand why a single piece of paper could silence an entire legal team, and why a mansion full of secrets still captivates people long after its owner is gone, we have to go back. Not to Hollywood, not to Broadway, but to a boy who almost never spoke. James Earl Jones's story begins not with red carpets, but with a chicken coop, a pencil, and nearly 8 years of near-total silence. He was born on January 17, 1931, in the tiny town of Occoquan, Mississippi, a place where skin color could determine whether you lived in safety or constant fear, and the voice of a poor black child was easy to ignore. His father, Robert Earl Jones, left before James was old enough to remember his face. His mother, Ruth Connolly, couldn't afford to raise him alone, so she sent him to live with his grandparents. It was on paper a decision for survival. In reality, it marked the beginning of a slow unraveling inside a child no one was really listening to. When James was 5, the family moved north to Michigan, hoping to escape the most brutal edges of Southern hatred. What they found instead was a winter that cut like glass. They had no proper house, no electricity. For months they lived in a converted chicken coop. Wind slid through gaps in the wooden slats. Each morning, James woke to the creak of a frozen ceiling, clutching a warm blanket, watching his own breath curl in the icy air. It was during that legendary winter of 1936 brutal snowstorms, a leaking roof ice coating the floorboards, that something inside him shifted. His grandmother later remembered a night when James, burning with fever, lay curled beneath the table. When he woke, his speech was broken. Words caught in his throat. Sentences crumbled halfway out. From that point on, he became more and more withdrawn. Every attempt to speak felt like his throat was being squeezed shut. At first, his grandfather thought it was a brief side effect of illness. But as spring turned to summer, James never recovered his ease. He answered people with nods and shakes of the head. In class, when teachers forced him to read aloud, his lips trembled, his face went pale, and tears stung his eyes before he could finish a sentence. He developed a severe stutter. Saying even a single word in front of others became a trial he dreaded. He stopped trying. He didn't play much with other children. He avoided conversations. He whispered only to the animals, the dogs, the cats, the livestock, as if they were the only beings who wouldn't judge the way his words broke apart. One former classmate would later recall a moment that stayed with them for life. James was called to the blackboard to read. He stood there frozen for 6 full minutes. No words came. The room grew more uncomfortable with every passing second, until the teacher finally asked another student to take his place. James returned to his seat in silence. For nearly 8 years that silence defined him. Then, when he was around 12, a winter night brought everything to a terrifying edge. His grandmother, waking, suddenly said she heard the faint creak of the back door. When she stepped into the yard, she found James out in the snow, hunched and distant, his face drained of color, his eyes empty in a way that made her blood run cold, as if he had reached some kind of breaking point a child should never have to reach. She did not scold him. She did not ask a single question. She simply wrapped her arms around him and held on, understanding more from his silence than words could have conveyed. The very next morning she took him to school and made a quiet request that he be placed in the class of one particular literature teacher, Donald Crouch, the only person she believed might be able to reach her grandson. Crouch did something no one else had done. He didn't demand that James speak. He didn't force him to read pages out loud in front of everyone. Instead, he handed him poetry. First a single line, then a stanza, then an entire poem. James stood before the class, hands shaking throat tight, tripping over the opening words. His voice broke and snagged, but as he pushed forward, something unexpected happened. By the time he reached the final line, he read it cleanly. No pause, no stumble, no apology. For the first time in years, he delivered a whole piece from beginning to end without faltering. Later, he wrote in his notebook that it was the first time in his life he felt his voice had weight. It wasn't just noise or a source of shame. It mattered. It landed. Teacher Crouch noticed something else, not just that James could speak when guided the right way, but the sound of that voice itself. Deep, resonant, a tone like weathered oak or aged whiskey. This voice isn't meant for everyday life, he reportedly remarked. It was born to fill an auditorium. But life was not about to hand James an auditorium. In the late 1940s, he was still a black teenager in rural Michigan called cruel names for his skin in a school using textbooks left over from World War I. Dreams of the stage were treated as fantasy, at best foolishness, at worst. After classes, he worked the fields with his grandfather, cleaned stables, hauled water from the well. At night, when the oil lamp went out, he slipped away to the granary reading poetry alone in the dark. He wasn't reciting for pleasure. He was training, forging his voice into something he could depend on, a tool that belonged to him even when everything else felt uncertain. In 1949, James was accepted to the University of Michigan to study medicine, but after 2 semesters he quietly switched to drama without telling his family or friends. When pressed about why, he gave a simple answer: he couldn't stay silent any longer. At school, he remained reserved. His roommate recalled how James always carried a small notebook, filling it with lines of verse and thoughts he never said aloud. One night, a professor walked into a campus bathroom at 1 a.m. and found him rehearsing a monologue in front of the mirror, eyes locked on his own reflection, like he was trying to meet someone he hadn't fully met before. "I'm learning not to fear the sound of my own voice anymore," James said. Maybe that was the real goal he chased his entire life, not fame, not statues, but the right simply to exist through his voice. A right that the boy who once drifted toward the edge of despair was finally starting to reclaim. Yet before stage lights ever shone on his name, James Earl Jones would spend nearly 2 decades living as an invisible man at the center of America. From the late 1950s, after leaving the military, James Earl Jones threw himself into theater not because he saw a clear path to fame, but because he was still fighting to reclaim the voice he had almost lost as a child. He started with small, barely noticed roles on off-Broadway stages in New York, where black actors were usually cast as waiters, guards, or nameless figures who walked on, spoke a few lines, and disappeared. He stood nearly 6'3", with a presence that filled any room, and a voice that sounded like it had been carved out of a cathedral wall. But to many directors he was still too much, too black, too serious, too powerful for the roles they were comfortable giving. At one audition for Hamlet, with a local troupe, he barely finished his first line before the director cut him off. Hamlet, they said, couldn't be black, and he certainly shouldn't sound like God preaching. Those words followed him all the way home. Not because they convinced him he didn't belong on stage, but because they exposed what he was really up against. Somewhere on that long walk he realized something. "I don't need them to believe I'm Hamlet," he would later suggest. "I just need them to believe I'm human." Keep going, he split his life in 2. By day he performed wherever he could, tiny productions, low payrolls that barely registered in reviews. By night he worked whatever jobs would cover rent, janitor, dishwasher, at an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, anything that kept the lights on. In the evenings, when most people were asleep, he returned to cramped rooms with peeling paint and damp walls and practiced Shakespeare alone. He recorded his voice on cassette tapes and played it back again and again. He wasn't just rehearsing lines, he was testing something. Could his voice still hold its own when no one else was listening? Could he trust it in those hours? The audience was just him, and the tape machine, and every replay was a reminder that he was building a weapon, a voice that could not be taken from him once he finally stepped into the right light. The first real turning point came in 1963 when he was cast in Othello at the New York Shakespeare Festival. This time, when he stepped onto the stage and spoke, the audience did not laugh or look away. They went silent. They listened. And when the curtain fell, the applause didn't sound polite. It sounded like release. Backstage director Joseph Papp took his hand and, according to those who were there, told him, "You don't need to ask for permission to speak anymore, James. You just took it back." That moment was more than a compliment. It was confirmation that the voice he had forged in barns and boarding houses could command a theater full of strangers. In 1969, his performance in The Great White Hope earned him a Tony Award and launched him into a new league. He was no longer just another working actor. He was suddenly a symbol, a black man, standing in a leading role in an industry that still hesitated to put people like him at the center of the story. The success put him squarely in the spotlight, but with it came something he had always feared, a loneliness that grew louder the more famous he became. In 1970, controversy erupted around an intimate scene between James and his white co-star Jane Alexander, both on stage and in the film version of The Great White Hope. The public focus turned harsh and obsessive. Some people treated the scene not as art, but as a transgression that needed to be argued over and condemned. In the middle of that noise, James made a choice. Instead of chasing more attention, he walked away from it. In 1973, he bought an old house in Pawling, New York for about $235,000, a fortune at the time. It wasn't a typical star mansion in Los Angeles or a glass-walled Manhattan penthouse. It was a secluded property tucked among trees and cold air, far from Hollywood's constant buzz. In one of his rare quiet interviews, he explained it simply, "I needed a place where my voice could echo without being interrupted." That property became his refuge for over 50 years. On the second floor, he constructed a soundproof chamber with walls reportedly over a foot thick. It had no windows, no main lights, just a microphone suspended in the air. To get in, you needed fingerprint access and a voice code. He called it the echo chamber. According to the only electrician who ever entered to check the wiring in 1984, the room left a mark hard to forget. He claimed that while working in a small corner, he heard James shouting in the dark for nearly 30 minutes, repeating a single line over and over. Why didn't he stay? It didn't match any play the electrician recognized. Many later believed those words weren't pulled from a script, but torn from the wound left by a father who had walked away before his son could even say his name. James never spoke about his father in public memoirs or major interviews. He avoided the subject completely. But in that windowless room, after every major role, he would reportedly retreat, shut the door, and confront something only he knew how to face. The echo chamber was where he scrubbed characters out of his mind one line at a time, before he allowed himself to simply be James again. Then in 1977 he accepted what seemed like a modest job, voicing Darth Vader in a strange, risky science fiction film called Star Wars. The fee was around $70, a one-time payment. There were no royalties, no long-term cut of what the character might become. At that moment, it seemed like just another gig in a career built on steady, unspectacular work. No one, including James, could have predicted that this faceless villain would become one of the most iconic characters in film history. As the movies exploded globally and Darth Vader's silhouette became instantly recognizable, the decision to take a flat fee haunted him. In private conversations with colleagues, he was said to have sighed, "My voice lives forever, but me, I was only hired once." According to some who worked with him, that regret followed him back into the echo chamber. Alone in the dark with only the microphone overhead, he may have recorded thoughts he never dared share publicly, fragments of stories, confessions, fears, and questions about what it meant to have a voice that belonged to the world while the man behind it felt strangely disposable. Whether those recordings still exist and what they contain remains part of the mystery that continues to surround that locked room. In 1982, After more than 2 decades of living, mostly alone with his work, something shifted in James Earl Jones's life. According to those who knew him, warmth finally walked through the front door of the Pauling mansion in the form of actress Cecilia Hart. She was talented, sharp, and quietly steady, not dazzled by his legend, but drawn to the man underneath. Over the next few years, they moved from colleagues to partners, and eventually to husband and wife. Together they built a quiet world that felt almost like it existed outside Hollywood time. With their son Flynn, they turned the isolated estate in Pauling into a true home. At one point, the family controlled a cluster of houses on the surrounding land, 10 properties wrapped in trees and open air, a green sanctuary far from red carpets and studio lots. Mornings followed a simple pattern. They would walk around the lake together, James and Cecilia, side by side, their son running ahead. They talked about new scripts, about the news, about small, ordinary things that never made it into interviews. Neighbors would later recall seeing them from a distance, the legend with the thunderous voice, and the woman who made him laugh like a regular man. In those walks, James seemed to finally have everything he had once thought was out of reach: a complete family, a refuge, and a peace he hadn't known since childhood. But peace has a way of ending without warning. In early 2015, Cecilia felt a sharp pain in her chest and found a lump in her breast. At first, she didn't assume the worst. Tests were run, appointments scheduled. Then the diagnosis landed like a blow: late-stage breast cancer. Suddenly, the man whose voice had commanded battlefields on screen was left in a position he could not control, watching the person he loved most fight something he could not argue with charm or overpower. The months that followed were brutal. Cecilia went through aggressive chemotherapy. Her hair thinned, then disappeared. Her strength drained away piece by piece. The mansion, once full of laughter, turned into a place where every footstep echoed. James sat by her bedside night after night, his large hands wrapped around hers, offering the only things he had left: quiet words, old stories, the simple presence of someone who refused to leave the room. By September 2016, doctors warned that there were only weeks left. Friends later said James struggled to accept it, as if some part of him believed that if he just stayed awake long enough, talked to her gently enough, refused to acknowledge the timeline, he could hold off the inevitable. In those final days, the conversations between them grew shorter. There was less to say. More of their communication happened in glances, in the way their fingers intertwined in the silence that had always been part of their relationship. On the night of October 8, 2016, Cecilia's body could no longer keep up with her will to stay. Around 3:00 a.m., with James holding her, she slipped away. The man who had spent a lifetime finding and protecting his voice suddenly found himself in a house where the only sound he wanted to hear, hers, was gone. Something in him broke. The Pauling mansion, once a symbol of refuge, became a museum of loss. He left her room untouched. The sheets stayed unwashed, still creased where her body had been. An alarm clock went off every morning at the same time, chirping into emptiness. No one turned it off. In the bathroom mirror, he wrote a sentence each day: "Cecilia, I still hear your voice." It stayed there like a private memorial, a message to someone who could no longer read it. According to those who visited in the months after her death, the house felt frozen. James moved more slowly. He rarely invited people over. The echo chamber, the library, the hidden spaces, all of them now belonged to a man walking through his own memories, trying not to drown in them. In his final years, his body began to fail him. Chronic heart issues and lung disease made even simple pleasures difficult. The walks around the lake stopped. Instead, he spent long hours in a small room by the window, where Cecilia used to sit and read scripts with him. Medical staff came and went. His son Flynn stayed close, but their days were often dictated by medication schedules and fatigue. It was said that James tried to hold on to small habits, listening to old records, flipping through worn pages of Shakespeare, reading aloud to himself when he had the strength. But the man who once filled theaters with his voice now often sat in near silence, his breathing the loudest sound in the room. On the night of September 9, his birthday and the last year of his life, events unfolded that would later turn into whispers and speculation. According to the nurse on duty, James asked to hear one particular record, a lullaby Cecilia had loved. The nurse put it on. Soft music drifted through the room. No one knows for sure whether James truly heard it or if the sound reached him only as a distant echo. Sometime around 3:00 a.m., he slipped away. Flynn was not in the room at that exact moment. There were no final speeches, no carefully staged goodbyes. Neighbors reported that the night was unusually quiet. No cars, no visitors, not even the faint sound of celebration for his birthday. Just darkness and the constant hush that had settled over the property since Cecilia's passing. Later, some neighbors claimed that around the time of his death, a light on the second-floor study flickered on by itself, even though the house's systems had reportedly been set to standby. Whether that was a wiring glitch, a coincidence, or something people only remembered after the fact, no one can say with certainty. But the detail became part of the story folded into the legend of the house. After his death, the Pauling estate turned from a home into an inventory. Estimates put James Earl Jones's net worth around $40 million, spread across real estate investments, and the value of his body of work. Lawyers, heirs, and executors arrived to list everything: the mansion, the surrounding properties, the art, the recordings, the contract. It was during this process that the secrets of the library truly came into focus. In the ebony desk where James had often worked, they discovered a hidden drawer that did not respond to keys or tools. It was locked to his voice, a biometric system he had quietly installed years earlier. With James gone, the lawyers tried different methods. At one point, a relative reportedly mimicked his tone, but nothing happened. Finally, someone played an old recording from 1977, a clear, measured reading James had done for a small project. As his recorded voice filled the room, the mechanism clicked. The hidden drawer slid open. Inside, there was an old contract from that same year, not with a major studio, but with a small production company dating back to the early phase of his career. On its own, the contract was not extraordinary. What froze the room was the note scribbled in his handwriting along the margin: "Accept this role, but stay silent." Nearby, another line even more unsettling: "Let the voice live, not the man." For the lawyers, this wasn't just a stray sentence. It sounded like a personal verdict, a decision James had made early in his life that defined everything afterward. Take the work, give them the sound, and keep the rest locked away. Further inspection of the studio uncovered a recording stored separately from the others, labeled in a way that made it stand apart. People who were there said the drive or tape, depending on which version of the story you hear, was safeguarded, but never publicly played. Some speculated it held his final words. Others believed it might be a confession or a message to Flynn, or even a raw, unfiltered recording of whatever he had poured into the echo chamber over the years. No one, at least officially, has admitted to listening to it. And the gardeners claim that on the night of September 9 that he heard a low whisper drifting from the attic, something like Darth Vader's rasp, but softer, more human, only added fuel to the speculation. Today the mansion is valued at over $3 million. Yet no one lives there. The furniture remains. The second floor where he honed his voice and confronted his ghosts is still locked. Locals say that every year on September 9, if you stand near the library window and hold your breath, the study light flickers and a faint murmur rises from somewhere above. Maybe it's old wiring. Maybe it's imagination. Or maybe it's what happens when a man spends a lifetime turning his voice into the world's property and leaves the rest of himself sealed behind walls no one knows how to open. James Earl Jones's passing was more than the death of a legend. It marked the end of a life spent balancing between visibility and silence, between the voice everyone owned and the man almost no one truly knew. The assets he left behind are easy enough to measure in dollars. The secrets, the notes, the recordings, and the strange systems he built to guard them are not. So the question lingers: if someone finally unlocks that unfinished recording, or fully reveals the meaning of those handwritten lines, Let the voice live, not the man. Will it change how we remember him? Or will it simply confirm what his life already suggested? That, in Hollywood, it's often the voice, the image, the myth that is treasured, while the human being behind it pays the quiet, devastating price. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well.